CURES, sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.
Helping you lead a healthier life. This is CURES.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the CURES Show, where we explore cutting-edge wellness from credible sources. I'm Kara Sundlin, and we're talking with child psychologist Dr. Laura Saunders about autism rates. Certainly, autism has been in the news a lot right now. The CDC estimates 1 in 31 children in the U.S. are on the spectrum. But with numbers on the rise, a lot of parents and families are asking, is autism becoming more common? Or are we just getting better at recognizing and diagnosing it? And of course, we will also touch on the controversy about environmental factors or the possibility of Tylenol and vaccines influencing autism. We're going to dive into it all. I'm here with Dr. Laura Saunders right now. Thanks for always being with us. And we'll take a look at the science, right?
Thank you for having me, Kara. Yes, we will. This is not about opinion. This is about the research.
Yeah, and I know that this is a touchy issue, but I think people want to know as much as they can so they can make informed decisions. Certainly, we all have friends who either are on the spectrum or have children who are on the spectrum. Let's start there. We're hearing even more and more adults get diagnosed with autism. Is it something, so to speak, in our environment that's damaging us? Or do we need to think about this as we're just getting better at diagnosing it, and it's something we've kind of always had in society?
So this is a good point. So let's start with the basics. And the basics is, yes, as you said, CDC is saying estimated 1 in 31 children are diagnosed with autism. Is it just that so many more people have autism now than 30 years ago? Yes and no, right? What we know is that the diagnostic criteria for autism has changed since the 90s. So in the 90s, the diagnostic criteria was much more narrow. And so it was really mostly diagnosed in childhood, and it was mostly the severe cases. So the severe cases were individuals who had usually a lot of the behavioral deficits, or showed a lot of behavioral symptoms. And it was they were more nonverbal. So it was the much more severe cases. As the diagnostic criteria has changed and it's become more expanded, so it's not just called autism anymore, it's autism spectrum disorder. So it's really looking at the core symptoms along a spectrum, from less severe to more severe. And we will talk about the core symptoms as well. So as the diagnosis has expanded, it has included a lot more individuals. As we said on Great Day today, when Scott said he didn't know any autistic kids when he was in elementary school. And what I pointed out was that if we look at our high school experiences, we all know people in high school or knew people in high school who were odd or different. And I don't mean those in pejorative ways, but those kids who had a lot of difficulty socializing or were kind of loners and had like really particular or peculiar interests in one or two things, right? So those kids back then, or certainly now, would be diagnosed on the autism spectrum.
Okay, so let's talk about nature versus nurture. I think there's concern that we all know we have a lot of pollution. We've got a lot of modern influences in our world. We often talk about the food and our from highly processed foods and all things. We've got a lot of disease right now. And so I think there is that concern that, oh my gosh, what are we doing in our environment that's causing children to maybe have these disorders? But when you look at the science, nature versus nurture, your genes versus maybe what's going on around you, what does it tell us at this current time?
So it's really, really important to always use credible sources, right? Not just Joe Schmo website, right? To always use credible sources. Major universities or the Centers for Disease Control. You're always using credible sources. You can find any piece of information you want somewhere on the internet that will verify some bizarre theory that you have. So I can't emphasize this enough. Always use credible sources. When you go to credible sources, you see that yes, we are saying that there's been a rise in autism, and we're also saying that in part diagnostic criteria have changed, and we are far better at diagnosing individuals who might be on the autism spectrum, or sometimes people self-diagnose on the autism spectrum. But when we're talking about what is kind of genetic or inherited versus what is an environmental influence, we're not really sure what some of the environmental influences are. It's just like, rates of allergies has gone up exponentially from when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I didn't know a single person that had a peanut allergy. Now I could probably name a handful, right? So we know things have changed. We don't always know what causes it. And that's the key word here. It's something is causal, right? A causes B versus correlational. Correlational in research means that there seems to be a connection between A and B, although we're not always sure what the connection is. Mm-hmm. And I don't need to go into the whole, like when A gets higher, B gets higher, when A gets higher, B gets lower, positive correlation versus negative correlation. I don't need to get into all of that. Yeah. But know that that's a correlational factor as well. So we don't know what the causes are. There have been some correlational data, but I think there's been a lot of misstatements made about the connections around vaccines and autism and Tylenol and autism.
Yeah. So let's start with vaccines. I've interviewed people who have thought they've been damaged by vaccines, who say they were okay, and I honored their experience that then they took a vaccine and they were not okay. And we do know that there can be some adverse side effects. So everything is risk versus benefit. But on a whole, there have been many, many studies done about vaccines and autism. And the one that got a lot of publicity maybe 10 years ago ended up being debunked, right? The man who did it actually apologized and basically admitted he lied about some things. But as of right now, are there any studies where we should be concerned about vaccinating children and having that lead to autism?
Right. So I'm not a vaccine expert. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm telling you the things that I've read on the research and on the evidence is that vaccines do not cause autism. As you just said, do sometimes adverse events happen after vaccines? Yes, that is why you consult with your medical doctor, your pediatrician about the risks and the benefits. Every medical professional you read about says that the benefits far, far, far outweigh the risks with vaccines. So again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a vaccine expert. Mm-hmm. However, vaccines work in part because of the population also. So as the population gets vaccinated, that's how you decrease the incidence of measles or whooping cough or polio or all those things that you get vaccinated for. And so it's as much about a population effect as it is an individual effect.
Yeah. In fact, we just had a story in the news the other day about cervical cancer perhaps might be eradicated and not exist anymore because even the people who are choosing not to get the Gardasil vaccine or the HPV, it protects against HPV, enough people are getting them that we're reaching to the point where we just may not have that issue, which is, of course, very serious. Women can die from cervical cancer. Let's bring up the Tylenol issue. That made a lot of news, and we know our president brought up questions about it, RFK Jr. bringing questions about it, and there are a couple of studies that ask questions about, as you mentioned, correlation and Tylenol. So if I'm a mom right now, of course I'm going to hear that if I'm pregnant and go, should I take Tylenol? From the perspective of where you sit as a psychologist looking at the data, what's your take?
So obviously, all individuals need to check with their medical doctor, their OBGYN, their provider when making personal medical decisions, right? So this is not about personal medical decisions. This is about conveying what some of the research has shown. Yeah. And the study that's been most cited is a very, very large Swedish study that looked at 2 million people. 2 million people. That is an unbelievable N, and the N is number. The reason they can do that is because in those countries, they can take mass amounts of birth data and track these individuals over time, that we have all sorts of privacy laws that we can't do that here, for better or for worse. So when they look at that data, they see some correlational changes, but they cannot say, I saw an interview with the head of that research study, and he is not saying that Tylenol causes autism. Okay. Again, I'm using that word cause. There are some correlational factors, but that is why you need to check with your individual provider. The information that's coming out is being grossly misrepresented and scaring people. And that's what I don't like. I don't want people to be scared. I want people to get information from credible sources, to check with their individual doctors, to make personal medical decisions. But Tylenol has been a medication that has been around and helpful for people for decades. And, what is also been said is that fever, a significant fever while pregnant, is actually very dangerous. So that is where individual personal decisions are made with your provider. But looking at the data, there is no causation between Tylenol and autism.
Yeah. So there's, and people can read more about this, but it's a Swedish study, 2.5 million people. They even looked at siblings to see, all right, one sibling has autism, one sibling does not, because then you'd have very similar genetics, and was it just Tylenol? And so this study, using all kinds of public health records, is not saying that. I know doctors are still doing lots of work, but at the moment, what we're saying is, and even the autism foundations are saying, it's just so complex. Autism is many, many things. It's kind of like, what's causing all this cancer? And it's not, their version is, it's not one thing. So you want to talk to your doctor. And you're right, maybe you don't want to, I think most of us who are pregnant don't want to take a lot of drugs unless you have to. But if you have a very high fever, or you have the flu, or you have something like that, you need to assess your own risks and benefits. So it's not as easy saying, this is what causes it. What about in other countries, if you know? Because there was a map going around all over social media about, like, look how much autism the U.S. has, and it's not in the rest of the world. Is that because they don't diagnose it the way we do?
Right. I mean, we have a diagnostic and statistical manual, right, put out by the American Psychiatric Association. That is, that's the diagnostic criteria that we use in this country. So I don't know that other countries use the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM. So we are using criteria, and it's generally based on decades of research, and that's why we're really looking at it, autism as a spectrum disorder. And we will talk about some of the core symptoms, because it's looking at those core symptoms along a spectrum. You can have some deficits, you can have severe deficits, you can have moderate deficits, all along that spectrum. And that's why the rates are different now than they were 30 years ago, because in the 90s we looked at it differently. And it makes sense, I guess, to me as a mental health professional, that our information evolves over time. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have a 35-year plus career at this point, and I've seen a lot of trends in the field evolve over time. And I'd like to believe that things get better, we get smarter, we get, based on evidence and research. And, I often go by my own clinical experience. I have decades of clinical experience that I go off of when I give a lot of, advice and recommendations and feedback. So we're evolving as a field.
Yeah, and so let's dig into your experience and the core symptoms. What really is autism? What are some of the telltale symptoms that we know are autism?
So there's 3 core areas of deficits. There's socialization, communication, and behavior. Those are the 3 core deficits: socialization, communication, and behavior. And so when we say socialization, that's understanding and responding to social cues, difficulty with eye contact, difficulty reading facial expressions, challenges with initiating and maintaining conversations, lack of interest in social interactions, right? So that's all the socialization piece. and again, we could do whole hours on each of these, but the communication is about language and speech development. You do see delays in language and speech development. Obviously, individuals on the more severe end of autism spectrum have significant delays in the development of language, right? We know from decades and decades of research that you need to really establish language by age 5 at the latest, or it's likely that you're not going to develop much in the way of language. So there's a lot of intervention for those young children who are showing significant delays in speech acquisition, because we need them to develop, from a brain perspective, need them to develop some kind of language, some form of communication before age 5. So you see delays in speech development, unusual use of language, either repetitive phrases, pronoun reversals, and then difficulty understanding nonverbal communication. So not understanding gestures, facial expressions, and then I can go into the behaviors as well.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk about, I mean, in history, people will read that Einstein didn't speak until he was like 4, and some thought that he might have autism or ADHD by today's standards. Or like, why would someone as an adult, clearly Einstein seems like a genius to me. I don't know what his IQ was, but I think we always refer to him as a genius. Does it have anything to do with intellect, autism?
So when we talk about, you can be extremely bright intellectually along a, pure IQ. And again, we don't have to go into this, actually many different types of intelligence. You can have visual spatial intelligence, or interpersonal or intrapersonal intelligence. You can have mechanical intelligence. There's all sorts of types of intelligence. But you could have someone that is very bright, but cannot read social cues. So you could have someone that could get, an 800 on the math SAT, but couldn't hold a conversation with someone, right? So there's all different types of intelligence. We all know those individuals. We used to kind of call them Asperger's syndrome, who were very bright intellectually. They were the kids in high school who were doing extremely well in classes. They're, our engineering schools are filled with kids who we would have previously considered to be on the autism spectrum, but they have significant deficits in their socialization and in their communication. But
Mark
they are
Zuckerberg,
very bright.
Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Meta, is known to have Asperger's. So sometimes these brilliant people. I mean, Elon Musk has said, "What do you think? I was normal growing up?" So some of these things, I guess, to understand that this, now we call it neurodivergence. But so Asperger's, that was another thing I was going to ask you. When you hear Asperger's syndrome, it is now on the umbrella of the autism spectrum. It used to be by itself. Is Asperger's what you're talking about, those people very, very high intellect?
Yes, they usually they're usually very bright, but they have the deficits in socialization and communication. They also often have what we call fixed interests. Like they might be super interested in trains, or they might know every, from the sound of a car engine, they might be able to tell you exactly what that make and model of the car is, right? They often have fixed interests as well. So it might be video games. So they have very, very bright intellect, maybe have some fixed interests, but they often have deficits in their ability to socialize and read social cues, and in their ability to communicate like feelings and emotions. You also sometimes see sensory sensitivities. It's not uncommon that individuals on the autism spectrum have some degree of sensory, that tags or certain materials of clothing really bother them. At times emotional dysregulation, sometimes motor coordination. So there's other things that go along with those core deficits.
Okay, and I think it's important to say that the experts who of the Autism Science Foundation and others say that it's not as simple as this causes it, because it's such a complex. If you know one person with autism and another person with autism, they could be very different, because there's so many different factors in how this brain is wired, but it's all now just on a spectrum. Is that right?
Right. Right. And I like the fact that you're emphasizing the word cause, because we're purposefully not using that word, right? We're not saying A causes B. We need to get away from that kind of mentality. What we're looking at in a lot of this is what we call correlational evidence or correlational research. There seems to be a connection between A and B. And again, there's no connection between vaccines and autism. We do not see any causation between Tylenol and autism. So you always need to check with your individual provider. But I worry that the general public doesn't understand the difference between correlation and causation. They just assume A causes B, and that is in fact what we're saying is not true. A does not cause B.
Okay. I want to take a quick break here from one of our sponsors, and we're going to come back and talk about even some symptoms if you're an adult wondering, could I have autism? Let's listen to this.
Struggling with gambling? Wheeler Health's Better Choice program offers personalized support and treatment to help you regain control. Visit WheelerHealth.org to learn more and take the first step towards recovery today.
All right, we're back with CURES. We're talking about autism. It's certainly been in the news a lot. What causes it? We've now established with Dr. Laura Saunders, a psychologist with 35 years of experience at the Institute of Living in Hartford Healthcare, that we've got about 80% of it being hereditary, and the other 20%, fair to say, we just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we do think that there are environmental factors, but we don't necessarily know what some of those environmental factors or causes are. And so, I mean, there's still ongoing data. That's why when you get a study that has, 2.5 million individuals as part of it, that's a lot of rich data, and you really want to look at that very closely. So we do know that there's a genetic component, and certainly in my clinical experience, it's very common when I meet an individual who's on the autism spectrum, they have a parent or first degree relative that's also on the autism spectrum. So we know there's a genetic component. There is some environmental factors, but we don't know clearly all those factors.
Okay, what if you're an adult, and we're hearing this more and more, where adults are being diagnosed with autism? Number one, is it important to get a diagnosis, or you already know you've lived this your whole life, and we used to think autism was just in kids, just like we thought ADHD was just in kids. Now we realize your brain is wired differently, and it's probably going to stay that way your whole life. But what symptoms, what does it look like? What does autism look like as an adult? And should people try and get a diagnosis?
So I think what a diagnosis is helpful for is it's helpful to when you can identify what's going on or the way that you relate to the world, it sometimes can just be very validating, right? So when an adult that might have ADHD, and again, you don't develop ADHD as a full-blown adult, you have to trace the symptoms back to before age 12. It's the same thing with autism, right? You don't just develop autism, or you're not on the autism spectrum starting at 25 or 35. You really need to trace those symptoms back, those core symptoms back to your childhood or adolescence. And you can have mild deficits in communication and socialization, but be kind of a intellectually typical person, or even a bright person, but not understand why you've had such difficulty in relationships or relating to other people or relating to coworkers. And I think having a diagnosis or identifying what it is can just be very validating, like, oh, that's why I've had so much difficulty getting along with people for all these years, or that's why I've really struggled with, understanding nonverbal communication. I mean, so I think sometimes it can just be very validating for an individual, especially on the autism spectrum. There's no medication that's going to fix this, but sometimes understanding yourself and understanding the way your brain works can be validating and help you better kind of make connections and make changes in the future.
Yeah. And what does it look like as an adult? What would be some symptoms? Are they the same?
I think they're the same, but I think if you're just getting diagnosed in adulthood, you're gonna most likely be on the milder end of the spectrum. You're going to have some deficits in socialization. You are that individual that really just always wanted to be alone all the time, or didn't really have a need for a lot of social connection the way other people did. Even if I'm not talking introvert extrovert, it's well beyond that. You're someone that may have had some social emotional difficulties, reading other people's emotions or understanding the level of empathy that's needed to be in a relationship. So you can see deficits on sort of the lesser end, so to speak. You'd see them more in socialization and communication, but you might still see some of those fixed interests, and those fixed interests can change over time. You probably wouldn't see a lot of the behavioral deficits. Because the behavioral deficits are much more obvious in like some of the hand flapping and some of the repetitive behaviors that individuals on the lower end of the spectrum tend to engage in.
Yeah, when we were growing up, we watched movies like Rain Man, and there was, almost very nonverbal or dangerous to be on your own. And there still are folks like that who are living in an institution, very different. In fact, there's been I've been reading articles that some were advocating they wanted to put ADHD on the spectrum with autism disorder. It hasn't happened, but that there's some crossover. We have about 3 minutes left. Let's talk about some of the sensory stuff, because folks with ADHD could also be very sensitive to how the clothes feel, or too much noise, or too much light. And yet we hear that a lot with autism also, that we need those sensory friendly experiences. Maybe that's not unique to just autism.
Well, if you think about it, so if you're an individual who has kind of sensory sensitivity, right? Or sensory can be kind of tactile, which is how your clothes feel, but it can also be people that are sensitive to smells and to sounds. It's not uncommon. You see someone on the autism spectrum with a headset over their head or earbuds in or something to kind of modify sound a little bit, because those sensory overload causes emotion dysregulation. You do see some emotion dysregulation in attention deficit disorder as well, which is why, sometimes we classify them as neurodivergent. But I think it really is looking at the origin of the symptoms and how the symptoms actually affect a person's ability to function. I don't know if we will put ADHD and autism spectrum under similar categories. I see the individuals as being very different, because you really want to see the deficits in communication and socialization for ASD, autism spectrum.
Some of the symptoms being very different, but I guess you'll see in the internet these crossovers of like, what's this, what's that, but there is some blending in different things. So it's just interesting as we learn more about how our brain works, how we're wired, and all of that. So with only 30 seconds left, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Laura Saunders, for having this conversation. I know we're all still learning, but to bring us up to the very latest on the science so people can make informed decisions and understand those who do have autism. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Kara.
All right, and everyone, thank you for watching the CURES streaming show and podcast. Find it streaming for free on WFSB Plus, our free streaming app, all the time, or on any podcast platform. Please like and subscribe. Let us know what you're thinking of the CURES podcast. Have a great day and be well.
CURES, sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.